Welcome to the Infidel, podcast of the damned, the weekly companion show of the Infidel News. Join us as we discuss this week's religious accounts from an atheist perspective. From Timbuktu to Toledo, from Kathmandu to Canada, from Bangalore to Bangladesh. We deplore, you deride. And here are your hosts, Dave and Nicole.
Hello, and welcome to show number 23 of the Infidel podcast of the damned. I'm your host, J. David Core, atheist, author, and actuated ambulist. And with me is my co-host, Nicole Smart. Hello, Nicole.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
Also joining us today is an Australian student currently studying Middle Eastern and Islamic history at university, Klingshore. Welcome to the show, Klingshore.
Thank you for having me.
Today is Thursday, April 8th, 2015, and we're going to be discussing the upcoming episodes of The Infidel, which will run beginning Monday, April 13th, 2015. Show notes for all of our podcasts can be found at infidelpodcast.blogspot.com. Every once in a while, I screw up the intro. Anyway, so we have a guest again today, a new guest, Klingshore, who recently put out a very interesting video. Nicole, you want to tell everybody what you thought about that video?
Oh, yes. It's called, Is It the Left That Fails to Oppose Islamism or Right-Wing Imperialists? Now, there are two things in there that I found interesting. First, he's looking at people who are saying that the left is the liberals are too easy on the Muslims, and that we are turning a blind eye on crimes, etc., etc. And then after that, and you can tell me if I got it wrong, Klingshore, but after that you go into history of the last 60, 70 years of the Middle East and how the Western governments did everything to suppress the left and to push as much as possible the actual Islamist people, or those who wanted to have an Islamic government, so that they would, and it was their way, the government's way of fighting the left, because in those days, for the longest time, even until recently, having the left in charge of anything is no good as far as the Western governments are concerned. And so that's been, I think the main thesis that Klingshore is bringing up is that attitude from the Western governments is what is responsible for today's situation in the Middle East. Now, did I get it right?
Well, I would clarify. I was concentrating more on, in the video, entirely on the left and not liberals. So I'm looking more at Marxists, anarchists, socialists, and communists than, say, liberals. Also, I would clarify that I would say that this sort of long-term, particularly American and British support, financial, logistical, political, for Islamism is a key factor. It's not the only factor, though. So another key factor, obviously, is Saudi support and Saudi imperialism, and also Pakistan played a key role as well. So I wouldn't say it's the only cause, but I would say it's a very significant factor that has to be taken into account, particularly when people say, the left doesn't criticize Islamism or whatever they say. I kind of think it's kind of trivial when you consider the right spent literally billions of dollars funneled into, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, supporting Sadat, all these various movements and regimes. So it just seems to me kind of
hypocritical?
Well, yeah, I guess. And not only that, but I've been able to find almost no. I don't deny that they exist. I'm sure they do. I've talked to people who network more on the left than I do, and they say, yeah, I've encountered some people who are like this, who do mitigate Islamism. So I won't deny that it exists. But in terms of verifiable evidence, I've been able to find almost no examples of this in my experience. The one example that people can actually cite is this report by One Law for All. It was a report on the pro-Islamist left, and they give like almost no examples. I think they cite like 3 groups. So it's actually really small. Now, when you compare that, like, okay, 3 groups to massive, government and military support, it's sort of like where all I ask is for some perspective, anyway. So that's hopefully, does that sort of clarify what I was up to and what I was doing?
Yeah, the video's very good.
And the point of the video wasn't even to identify the cause for Islamism. All I was doing was identifying the relationship between right-wing governments, the left, and Islamism internationally. What has been the relationship characteristically? So that's that hopefully that clarifies. Oh, also one more thing to add is that the point of the support was political expediency. So when Islamism is no longer politically expedient, they also get attacked. So now we have post 9/11. The US is attacking is antagonistic or against ISIS, for example, or Boko Haram. So it's and will also support secular dictatorships. So, for example, Mubarak in Egypt, and now the current dictator there, or Iran under the Shah, for example, that was secular. So it's whatever facilitates the politico-economic interests. So it's not like a principle like we must support Islamism. It's they happened to support Islamism for a long time pretty consistently when it was expedient, and that was the point of the video, was to highlight that relationship. All right, I've talked for too much, so
well, my issue is, I consider myself about as liberal an American as you're going to find, without being, a tree hugger, and I don't go quite that far, but the idea that the left coddles Islam is that it's actually reactionary to the right in the current atmosphere. It's the right's attacks on Islam as an umbrella.
It's the xenophobia. It's the conspiracy theories. Like, or you can't trust Muslims. They can't be friends, or they're all doing taqiyya, or they're all. It's this kind of. It's not just, oh, I don't like the Quran, it's got some crappy bits in it. That's fine. It's this hysteria, and people react to that. And then because people are criticizing the hysteria, like left liberals or people who are socially progressive, the right then, or people like the conservatives on the right, I should say, then say, oh, you're defending Islam, why aren't you criticizing it? And so it's, would you say that is that what you're elucidating?
That's exactly my point. Yeah, it's not, and then you have that, like we had that famous argument with Sam Harris, Ben Affleck, and Bill Maher, where Bill Maher is hearing everything that they were saying through a prism, and he was right and he was wrong, and then Sam Harris was hearing everything Ben Affleck was saying through his own prism, and everything he was saying was right and it was wrong, because they were speaking in shorthand at each other, and it was different shorthand.
No,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to agree.
Well, I was what I'd like is some of the historical examples you gave, because I've always been a fan of history, and so except that the Middle East is not my forte. I've never really spent any time except maybe a bit of the Second World War, and that's it. But I liked some of the examples that you gave, like, for example, when the Americans were dropping leaflets that said that Allah's hand... how did you go again?
The British. That was the British.
Okay.
In there was a Marxist rebellion occurring in Oman, and yeah, they said the hand of God smashes communism. Yeah.
So
that's
that's an
bizarre.
example of how, the Western world is partly responsible for Islamism being so strong today, because when they had a choice between the left or Islamism in those days, well, the left was the worst enemy possible, so they kept pushing, to against the left.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so in today's show, we're going to examine a couple of current news stories that all relate to uh, uh, Islam around the world in different parts of the world, and overreaction. So that's what the theme is for all three of the stories that we're going to look at. So we'll go ahead and look at those stories and discuss them one by one, and then at the end of the show, we'll talk with Klingshore a little bit more about what he's got going on.
Okay, here's the first story.
Prime Minister David Cameron's Conservative Party is promising some changes with respect to Sharia law in Britain if it wins the upcoming elections in May. The promise was made by Home Secretary Theresa May recently, saying that the country's democratic values must be preserved, and that for those who do not share those values, she added, "we will not tolerate your behavior." This represents a turnaround in a country that has so far allowed Sharia law to be practiced in localities where the Muslim population was relatively dense. May also called on moderate Muslims to join in an effort to turn back extremism that has led to terrorist acts, both in England and around the world. To temper her remarks and not appear to single out Muslims, she additionally called for other forms of extremism to be defeated, including views considered to be far right. The upcoming election is expected to be a close call, and plans are underway to provide added security ahead of time.
And Jenny's parrots make another appearance on the Infidel. That's our newsreader, Jenny McDermott, who we love to death, but she has some parrots with minds of their own that every once in a while they just want to be heard. So, but anyway, so here we have a prime example of the kind of thing that we were talking about with right wingers overreacting to what they see as the Islamic threat, because there were some of the things that they were talking about, like trying to get moderate Muslims to help tamp down on extremism. That's all valid, but then when you start talking about Sharia and you're trying to take over our country and we won't have it, and that kind of stuff is there's a certain organic flow that history takes, and things change. And in the modern age, they change faster and faster. And it's Luddite thinking. It's this fear of change that and if they really thought back to it, if you really think back to it, Christianity was a change when it came. So, so this thing that they're trying to hold on to as their tradition and their history is no different than this coming in. But this isn't coming in under unnecessarily. If it's allowed to just happen organically, and if it happens, I don't think it would happen anyway. I don't think Britain is going to turn into an Islamic state. But if it did happen organically, that would be the natural course of things.
Something interesting, and maybe I'll save this for later, actually, because I wanted to talk about ideology and its passivity. But it's for most of Islamic history, Sharia law has not been implemented because it doesn't work. So it's very interesting that people are so afraid of Shariaization or creeping Sharia, when in Muslim history it was never really implemented apart from in very, very limited capacity. So it's sort of like people are afraid of being subject to something that Muslims themselves have almost never been subject to. So I just find that really ironic. But anyway, maybe I'll save this for deeper elucidation subsequently.
Yeah.
Well, over here in Canada, they tried, some politicians tried to bring the same idea of Sharia just for the sake of family justice, like family court, and it didn't fly. People were all against it, and it was like a Led Zeppelin. It flew like a Led Zeppelin, let's just say.
Yeah. Right.
Was there an example from Canada? I can't remember. I think I read this in Doug Saunders' The Myth of the Muslim Tide, which is a fantastic book. He goes through. He's like a journalist, very famous journalist who specializes in immigration history, and he went through and he examined all of the data concerning Muslim immigration, polling data on Muslim opinion in the West, etc., and also with comparative examples. And he looked at all the fears that people express and the politicians express, and he just completely destroys it. So, like in France, for example, I think like 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 Muslims aren't religious. So they're Muslim as a cultural category. So what he showed that actually Muslims are integrating very rapidly, following the same kinds of integration patterns that prior immigrants have followed, and the rates of religiosity and levels of fanaticism are very, very quickly, and social views, conservative, progressive, are very, very quickly adapting to be proportional to the host societies in which they live in. So there's only one exception to this, which is a bit of a blip, which is actually Britain, which is slightly exceptional for some reason. But yeah, that's the general trend. Anyway, in his book, which I highly recommend, either in his book or in one of his talks, he talks about, I think that's the source, I think it was Canada, and how there was some campaign to get rid of Sharia or disallow Sharia, but it was successful. But it wasn't just Sharia, it was all religious law or family law or something like that. And so what ended up happening was this weird situation where actually obviously the Christians didn't want this. So they ended up going back, and it ended up with Muslims, Christians, and Jews sort of uniting to try and reverse this. So where once the Christians had opposed Muslims being able to have their sort of religious discretionary courts, or I don't know what the situation is in Canada, I don't remember, but whatever it was, you then have this hilarious sort of reversal where they now have to work together to try and return back to that old status quo. Anyway, is that correct?
The thing is, it varies from province to province. So each province has a different situation. They have their own laws, and so I'm not sure what happened in other provinces. Except I know in Quebec, some Muslims. There was a Muslim woman who was fairly well known and who spoke vehemently against having Sharia law. And in Ontario, where I live, I must say that it's extremely secular. Public schools are the idea of secularism, and that's all there is about our public schools. No religion, except for in the smaller regions. And actually, I live in the area of Canada that's the most multicultural, and I would say that all immigrants over here integrate very well. It's really, really well. Like, what's the name of the Indian comedian? His last name is Peters. He does monologues.
Russell Peters?
Russell Peters, yes. He's from my
dad's a big fan of him.
Well, he is from right here where I live. He's from Brampton, Ontario. He's an example of what we've got the largest Indian population in Brampton outside of India, and here's what we do. Here's how well they integrate. We end up with people like Russell Peters, so it just goes very well.
Yeah. There was an episode of The Good Wife. Have you ever seen The Good Wife? Either of you? It's an American TV show. Anyway,
I don't watch television.
Okay. Well,
Nor do I.
I watch a lot of TV. She's a lawyer whose husband was the governor, and he cheated on her, and they ended up getting divorced. And it's all about started out being all about that, and now it's just about her law firm and stuff like that. And but anyway. The point is there was an episode where they were hearing a case that was similar to like the Monsanto case, where Monsanto's seeds got on in somebody's land, but it was about this retailer who was selling alfalfa or corn or something. There was a genetically licensed seed, and there was a farmer who was growing corn that he said the seed came by wind, and the other guy said no, you had to have stolen some in order to get it. So, but they decided to hear it in a Christian court because they were both Christians. So they had to take the whole thing to a Christian arbiter, and he got to decide the case. And they based everything, and all the decisions were based on the Bible. So the law firms had to argue from the Bible on both sides. So it was a really interesting episode that I don't think Americans have ever seen anything like that before. But that's basically what these Sharia courts are: is people agreeing that they're going to let an imam adjudicate for them instead of the courts.
A qadi. The judge is called a qadi. And he will consult, presumably. I mean, I guess he could just do Rai and be naughty. But he will consult the jurisprudence, the precedents, the prior workings out of prior jurists, which are based on the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the exemplar of Muhammad as preserved in the Hadith literature. And from the jurisprudence based upon these sources, he then will find a precedent or something and make a ruling based upon that, and whether or not it's applicable to the situation. And you're right, they're supposed to be consensual for both parties, and so if they're not, then that's illegal.
Right, it's illegal, and so there's no real worry.
I mean, illegal in British law. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So what's your take on this on the news story then, as far as the politicians? Yeah.
I don't know much about it, so I'm only kind of guessing here. But my suspicion would be that this is a political ploy to try and take some of UKIP's support base and to try and take some of that popular sentiment and to bring them over to the Conservative Party. I mean, if they've got a state and they all they want to do is to make sure the laws of the state are implemented, then fine, I guess. But most of the hysteria about these law courts, I think, is way overblown. But I mean, there is. I'm sure there are some cases where people haven't been consenting, etc., etc. This is why you have this One Law for All campaign spearheaded by Mariam Namazi. But it shouldn't be overblown. I think you have the same kinds of problems with Jewish community. You have these Beth Din, these conservative and Haredi Jewish law courts, which are also incredibly conservative as well. So if there's a problem with people being coerced, this is not a problem with the Sharia courts per se. This is a problem with people being coerced. I mean, you just have to be consistent with the law, and the law allows for these discretionary courts if both parties are consenting. So other than that, I don't know what else there is to say on the matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but wouldn't you say though that people like David Cameron, even though they're just piggybacking on UKIP's message in order to do that, they're ginning up animus a little bit unnecessarily?
Yeah, I guess implicit in making a big deal out of this is that there is a big deal to be made, and I would question how significant that is. This. I mean, what I guess you could argue that what he's drawing upon there is this popular fear of creeping Sharia and Islamization, etc., etc., which is just kind of crap, to put it succinctly. So, I mean, yeah.
But, well, he's being opportunistic. I think he's being opportunistic, and that's it.
That's exactly it. I guess something I might be worth bringing up in this respect is a parallel example. So back from I guess from the 1600s to the 1930s, Anglo-America felt very, very deeply threatened by a religious group. And this religious group, this religious community, they were swarming in from overseas, swamping the country demographically. They were anti-democratic. This is as they were characterized in all this massive literature that was produced. Anti-democratic. They were seeking to destroy American liberty and personal freedoms. They were innately treacherous and exclusively loyal to foreign religious authorities. These foreign religious authorities and this religion were seeking secular power. They were pedophilic and allowing this. They were breeding. They were breeding. They were breeding incessantly and going to swamp us demographically. They had schooling systems that were indoctrinating the immigrants to loyalty to these foreign powers instead of loyalty to the U.S. and they were spreading subversive sentiment, and they were subservient to the infallible diktats of their religions, with the commands of which superseded all other law and American law. You can guess who the group is, surely.
Yes.
It was the Roman Catholic Church, and this was extreme. Like churches were bombed. You couldn't get elected as a Catholic. L. Smith tried to get elected. He couldn't. He was Catholic. The KKK comes out of this milieu. Part of their extreme fear wasn't just black people. It was also Jews, but also especially the Catholic Church was their huge fear. And
my great grandfather ran for mayor of St. Mary's, West Virginia, and the KKK marched against him. And
Wow.
There was a guy who owned, who was a barber in town. He was really tall. He was like 7 foot tall, and he was wearing his KKK hood and marching. And my grandfather quit going to him as a barber, and he saw him in a bar one time and said, "Why did you quit coming?" He said, "That was you marching against me." He said, "How do you know it was me?" He says, "You're 7 foot tall."
I guess, but I mean, it's really interesting history of this anti-Catholicism, and JFK was the first Catholic who could finally be elected as president.
And he had to promise not to
right, exactly. He still faced this Protestant nativism. Now, were there some real issues? Yes, obviously the pedophilia thing, that was a real problem, right? Just as, with Muslim immigration, there are some real problems. You do have some Wahhabis, you do have some abuses of the Sharia law courts, some people are not consenting. There are some real issues. But I would say that most of it is just hysteria. And that was the case demonstrably with Catholicism. It was just, and what I find very interesting is that most of the key claims that are being made about Muslim immigration are the exact same, virtually the same, as the claims that were made against Catholics, which tells you something really important. You can swap out the demographics. You can swap out who is actually being targeted here or talked about, but the core claims stay the same. So it tells you that this is less about the actual given demographic and more about the core features of nativism and xenophobia. Right. So again, I would really recommend the work of Doug Saunders. He does comparative analysis of this. Anyway, you've got more clips to show, so I'll shut up.
Let's go on to the next story.
Okay, second story.
An Afghan woman known as Farkhunda was brutally killed recently over what appears to be a distortion of the facts. The woman, who otherwise seems to have been a very conservative Muslim and a teacher of Islamic studies, had complained that a local imam was selling trinkets to the poor and claiming that they had mystical powers. At least that's the version of the story being told by her supporters. Prior to being dragged behind a car, thrown into the Kabul River, and beaten by an angry mob, she had been accused of burning a copy of the Quran, one of the most forbidden acts and punishable by death according to Muslim beliefs. Regardless of these details, there is now outrage at the mob action itself, as well as the inaction of local authorities who apparently did nothing to stop the brutality that took 2 hours to kill the 27-year-old Farkhunda. Now 13 people, including 8 police officers, are under arrest for either participating in the mob action or failing to stop it. Acts such as this serve as a setback to a gradual reform movement in a country known for unfair treatment of women. Afghanistan has responded to international pressure to allow women to be educated and gain employment, but progress has been too slow for many. Now they say that the attention brought to the country by this violence might serve to bring even more pressure along these lines, since it came as Afghan President Ashraf Ghani prepared for a trip to Washington seeking military and economic aid.
So, okay, this kind of thing, when this kind of thing happens, this is what these reactionary people hear, and this is what they're afraid is going to happen in their countries. This is what they think is going to happen there. But this is happening in countries that don't have a strong secular presence to keep it in check. So
well, I guess this, first of all, obviously, I mean, this is grotesque. You know, it's very sad. Also, there was I think bloggers in Bangladesh who were hacked to death recently, and obviously you have this attack on the university in Kenya by Al-Shabaab. But I guess on that level, what you'll notice is that this sort of thing almost always goes on in regions that have been torn apart by war or imperialism or some sort of extreme strife. So Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, like it's not a coincidence that this sort of behavior happens in regions that are extremely underdeveloped and that have been exploited, and this is the necessary
but it is also happening
pretext for this.
Right, but it is also happening in Pakistan, which is not in Pakistan. They've been attacking churches and Hindus.
True, but I guess the situation in Pakistan is that you've had this extreme Islamization of the country as deliberate political policy by the dictator Muhammad Zia al-Haq, with American support and British support, I might add. Reagan and Thatcher looked on with glee. So that's important. Also, the country is like, so you have in the north the Pashtuns, for example, who are quite disenfranchised. A lot of the political groups in Pakistan are extremely disenfranchised, and you have like on the verge of civil war. So the Pashtuns in the north, the Baluchis in the south. So you have this extreme. This political disenfranchisement, this extreme political religionization of the region. I mean, it's on the. I think some people say Pakistan's on the verge of being a failed state. So again, this is the important context that sort of helps to explain. And you have drone strikes also occurring in Pakistan by the US. So it's again, this is the necessary context. This stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. It isn't like, I mean. You have a set of let's say you've got a set, right, Muslims, right, as a group, right, but you have a wild variety of behavior within that set. You've got some Muslims who drink alcohol, who I know personally, for example, and many who don't, some who pray, some who don't, some who have sex before marriage, some who don't, right? So what you'll notice is that usually when you have this kind of militant behavior and this kind of lashings out, mob killings, etc., this usually happens determined by a context, and the context is countries torn apart by imperialism or internal repression, civil war, extreme inequality, etc. So I guess that it isn't simply, Islam equals mob killings. So if Islam comes here, we'll have mob killings. I mean, there's just that it's just a completely untenable view. I mean, it's just empirically false. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly the point that I was making initially too. Is that it's an overreaction and an oversimplification to say that this is what Islam is, because
I mean, Islam is whatever Muslims make it. Religion is whatever religionists make it, and people are determined by their context. I mean, it's just, and this is what I really want to talk about. But I'll let you play more clips before we get into this, because it's a really fascinating history of the way in which you can identify ideology being passive and being completely modulated by context. And some of them will be very surprising, especially given the claims that are made about Sharia and its threateningness. It will be quite interesting to juxtapose that fear with the historical reality. But please continue with
sure.
clips.
Let's do the next story.
Okay, third clip.
In lieu of a $100,000 bond, 67-year-old Michael Conrad Sibley of Marietta, Georgia, found himself in jail following his arraignment in the U.S. District Court in Atlanta after he confessed to placing improvised explosives on federal lands. According to statements he made to the FBI on November 4, 2014, Sibley left a backpack containing explosives he learned to make on the internet in Vickery Creek Park in Roswell, Georgia. Hoping to raise awareness that Muslim terrorists could do this kind of thing anywhere, Sibley planted bogus evidence with the bomb, including what he thought was a foreign-sounding name, random schedules, and addresses for sporting events, Jewish facilities, and train routes, as well as a copy of the Quran. According to a document released by the FBI, Sibley told agents that he is a patriot, and he felt no one was paying attention to what was going on in the world. When the bomb was discovered by a hiking mother and daughter, the device was detonated by a bomb squad, and several of the locations noted on the bogus documents found with the bomb were placed on heightened alert.
So, I like that. A foreign-sounding name.
Yeah, a foreign-sounding name.
Habib Abdul Aziz El Islami.
The name that he put in there was actually, I mean, it was a backpack. It was a student backpack, and he actually put in a name that would have been a female name. It would have been a feminine name, but it wasn't.
Abu Bakr Omar Muhammad Usman El Islami. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But it was ridiculous.
That's horrible.
But I mean, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of a thing. Like, look, Muslims can do this anywhere. Yeah, so can right-wing extremist nutcases. That's what he proved, was that the right wing is dangerous.
There's actually a very long history of right-wing terrorism in the United States. It's really interesting, actually, and it connects to that what I was talking about before with nativism. There's throughout U.S. history, there's been a very long history of extreme nativism and paranoia. This whole thing of like these militias and these like paramilitary movements go back quite a long way. So this you'd be surprised how common these kind of attacks actually are. Unfortunately, it's just the way the news functions, I guess. But they don't get covered that much. But there's a lot of it goes on. Sorry. Anyway, continue.
Well, the thing is, you was talking about the news, that are covered. Earlier, you were talking about some examples of things that are happening around the world. Like the blogger who got killed, etc. And the thing is, those are not news that you find in the mass media. But not that I want to brag about the Infidel, but those are the news that we cover. And those that we haven't covered yet that you mentioned will be covered in the coming weeks.
Right.
So that was a little plug-in.
Yeah. The story that you mentioned about the, was it in Kenya? Where
Al-Shabaab, they attacked a university.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I pointed that story out to Nicole last week because I didn't think it was getting enough play. I've heard about it a little bit more since then, but it was really, I mean, there's pictures of just piles and piles and piles of dead students, and it wasn't a big deal. The Boston bombing story was like 24/7, and this story is like a blip.
Yeah,
it's ridiculous.
or even Paris with the Charlie Hebdo. I mean, it got extreme coverage. Yeah. I guess. I don't know. I mean, look, it makes sense, right? If I'm living in a culture, obviously, the most people will connect more and be more interested in issues relating to their culture and not others. But it is unfortunate that people in other regions or of other cultures basically are pretty much sidelined when stuff like this happens, vis-a-vis when your group is attacked. So Boston Bombings, massive coverage. Charlie Hebdo, massive coverage. I mean, it's pretty...
Yeah.
Well, even with Charlie Hebdo, when it came to the Jewish store, the kosher store that reopened 2 months later, it was like quiet on the Western Front. Nobody mentioned anything about it except for us. Hey.
Yeah. The there was a story about I want to say that it was 16 years ago, because I think it was during the Clinton administration, at least 16 years ago. There was a story that there was situations. The situation was really bad in Somalia, and nobody was paying attention to it. And so there was a model, a supermodel from Somalia that kept talking about it.
Oh, was she married to David Bowie?
Yes, Imam.
Ah, yeah.
Yes. And she kept talking about it, and that's how people learned about it. Nobody knew it was happening, but they became interested because she was talking about it.
Well, I mean, right now, like there's, like throughout Africa, you still have lots of horrible movements, ongoing conflict. You know, there was something recent that I found out about. Death squads, I think, in Honduras. You know, like, it's just, like, you still have, like, all these horrible killings and militias going on all around the world.
That's South
everywhere.
America.
Oh, yeah, that was South America. Yeah, Honduras.
Yeah.
It was, like, I guess, most people just aren't aware. Most people obviously rely upon the news, and the news tends to focus on themes, right? So at the moment, the theme would be Islamism, so that gets hyper-focused. And you know, so, and unfortunately, all these other things that are going on all around the world all the time, you know, don't get covered. But, you know, there's you have similar kind of stuff happening everywhere around the world.
Yeah, well, everywhere that Rupert Murdoch has his hand in,
Yeah. Sorry, guys. we produced him. There is a we.
Well, in Canada, we pride ourselves of having produced Conrad Black instead.
Black. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a story coming out on Conrad Black.
Absolutely.
Just because. Yeah, that was another one too. I had to look up while I was writing the story. I had to look up who Conrad Black was, and I thought, so I'll just begin the story by explaining who Conrad Black is, because I don't think anybody in America knows who he is. So.
Actually, I had to make a few additions and slight corrections to the whole thing, because
I just got it from Wikipedia, so if it's wrong.
Look, because the thing is, you had mentioned that he's a Canadian and with all the titles, but in order to get those British titles, he had to renounce his Canadian citizenship.
Okay, so I didn't know that. It wasn't in Wikipedia.
So he's no longer a Canadian.
Right, and I also mentioned that he was a convicted felon, but I didn't mention that it was in the United States.
Yeah.
Because
what was he convicted for?
Fraud. He sold. He was selling stock in his companies based on bogus information, and people lost their money, and he was sitting pretty. And so they initially convicted him on several charges, and several of them he won on appeal, but he lost enough of them that he still had to serve 3 years in an American prison.
Yep. So,
but he was talking about the story that we did on him was he was challenging Richard Dawkins and several other militant atheists in one of his articles, and championing a Christian apologist. And
Conrad Black.
Conrad Black was, yes, in one of his opinion pieces. And
wow, so one of the most powerful men in the world with a gigantic media empire is that's fantastic. Is promoting this Christian agenda. That's ideal.
Yep.
Fuck yeah.
Coming soon on the Infidel.
And his writing was painful to read. It was like a chore to try to the sentences were so they were proper English sentences, but they just didn't make any sense. They were like so densely structured for no good reason. I don't know what he was doing.
It reminds me of there's a mining baron. I don't know what the correct term is for someone who owns lots of land and mining companies. But whatever. Magnate, maybe. Let's say mining magnate, called Gina Reinhardt. And she did a similar thing where she wrote a poem in favor of, I think it was in favor of deregulation in the free market. and she had the poem installed at all of the mines on like a plaque or something. And it's just kind of when people who have a lot of power force everyone else to suffer their shitty writing, their poor prose, they're it's like, well, because they have the means to, they can force their poor art on the rest of us. Even more incentive for us to precipitate a glorious revolution, comrades. Let us not suffer anymore the art of Comrade Black and Gina Reinhardt.
Yes, LRH. That's, I don't know if it. that's
Yeah.
that's a Scientologist. That's how they are constantly cheering on L. Ron Hubbard by saying LRH. But which anyway, yeah. Okay. That was all of our stories. So that was all of our stories, right? That was all three of them.
Yeah, and there's only the Christian glitches left.
Right. So we'll look at the Christian glitches, and then we'll talk with you for a little bit about your work.
Okay.
Get your quick reaction to what's going on in your home state of Arkansas. Very different subject. The governor, Asa Hutchinson, as you well know, decided he wasn't going to sign into law this religious freedom bill, in part based on what's going on in Indiana right now. Your reaction?
Well, Wolf, in Arkansas, we believe in religious freedom. That's one reason why our
everybody believes in religious freedom.
That's one reason why our
But the question is the potential discrimination against gay Americans.
The Religious Freedom Restoration Act was signed by former Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton in his first year in office. These laws are modeled on that, and a lot of the concerns about discrimination haven't been borne to bear over the last 20 years. But I also think it's important that we have a sense of perspective about our priorities. In Iran, they hang you for the crime of being gay.
That's his argument.
Delightful.
Yes.
It's like, well, Iran is worse, so just be satisfied.
I know. Yeah.
Right.
Let's put things in perspective.
Yeah. You can either be discriminated against or else you can be hung. Take your pick.
Yeah. Look, it's like it's like where is the current what's happening in America right now with the black community and the police? What's that city called?
That's Ferguson, Missouri.
Ferguson, yeah. And so it'd be like saying, look, people being shot, but at least this isn't South Africa's apartheid. Hey, it's not Rwanda, so just be okay with it. It's like, what kind of argument would that be?
You actually do hear that. You do hear that argument, though.
Really?
You will hear that kind of argument made. It's absolutely ridiculous.
But at least you're not slaves anymore.
Yeah.
Oh, okay then. Well, when you
you'll
put
hear
it
that one
like
too.
that, shoot me. Come on. What kind of?
Well, and they'll point out Jim Crow is no longer in effect and everything like that. Well, we did.
Well, I guess it's all good.
Yeah. What do you want? 20 acres and a mule?
Yes.
Jeez.
So I thought that was a very typical Christian glitch there of stupid logic that you get from the fundamentalist right-wing nuts.
Yeah, and they're not. They do that so blissfully unaware that they're doing it too. Like it comes back and bites them, and they don't know why. For example, here's just an example of off topic, but you remember when Mitt Romney was? I don't know if you saw this or not in Australia and Canada, but when Mitt Romney was running for president, there was a debate that he had, and in the middle of the debate, he turned to Governor Perry from Texas and challenged him to a $10,000
bet.
Yeah. Okay. So that was a big deal. Well, this week, during the Final Four, which is a big thing in basketball in the United States, Rick Perry or Mitt Romney apparently supported the winning team, and he said he wished he had bet $10,000 on the game. Like $10,000 is the only number he knows that sounds to him like a small number, but is really not.
He could give it to me. I've got a few things I could buy with that.
Yeah.
Yes. I remember when he made during the debate, he offered a $10,000 bet as if it was nothing.
And he didn't learn from that. He did, and he tweeted that again this week.
Wait, did he lose the bet?
No, he would have won the bet had he bet. He didn't bet, but that's what he said. He said, "Oh, I wish I'd have put $10,000 on that. $10,000 means nothing to him. $10,000 bet. He had another $10,000. So what? You know, but I don't have $10,000 to bet. So when I see him say something like that, it's almost like he's saying, he's just throwing it away. Oh, I wish I'd bet $10,000, but. Yeah, I wish I'd bet $10 on it, but I didn't. And if I said that, it wouldn't be a big deal. But he says 10,000, it's a big deal because his followers don't have $10,000. Asshole.
Well, that's why I think a lot of people are thinking that Apple is making a mistake by having their luxury watch for $10,000 but we keep looking at it as some form of investment from the point of view of people who wish we had $10,000 to burn. When you're somebody like Mitt Romney, for whom $10,000 means nothing, sure, I'll get myself an iWatch. No problem. It's nothing.
Right. There's actually a current commercial on in America right now where these three rich people pull up in their plane and they keep saying AT&T or some phone company, I forget which phone company it's for, asked us if we wanted to switch phones. And I said, why? And they said, because it's cheaper. And I said, why? And they said, so you can save money. And I said, why? And they said, so you can buy things. But we have all the things. We're rich. And the point of the commercial is everybody's not rich, but they're making these people look like assholes. But it's undermined. The parody is undermined by actual rich assholes.
The reality.
Yes, and actually that's part of the problem with what's going on in the Middle East. We've got rich assholes who think that what they're doing to the Middle East doesn't harm anybody, and they're actually doing good when in fact they're harming people.
Right, and the whole and that's all, actually that translates all the way down to first world, third world, where first world people, who most of us are that are watching this, don't really associate third world lives as equal. It actually goes that far. I mean, I'm sure all three of us try to make an effort to, but in general, we all know people who, when they hear stories about what happened in Kenya, just don't think anything about it because those are third world people.
Well, I guess it's like I was saying before. It's if people who are part of your culture that you identify with or that are around you or near you, you can humanize. But when it's just a number like, a million women have been raped in the Congo throughout the course of the horrible civil wars that have been going on there. It's just a number. It's, okay. And then you go, oh, that's gross, and then forget about it. Or whatever. So I think it's just human nature. It's just the way we are. You can just...
Yeah. Well, that's why
distance dehumanizes, you might say, or levels of disconnection lead to people just being names and numbers, I suppose.
That's why I really admire what General Dallaire did in Rwanda. I don't know if you two are familiar with General Dallaire. He was the Canadian general in charge of the UN forces in Rwanda. And when the UN, decided that they should pull all their forces out of Rwanda because a bunch of Belgian soldiers had been killed, the UN decided they were going to pull all their soldiers. And Dallaire decided, no, I'm sticking here, and we're going to be flashing the light on what's going on here so that the rest of the world will know what's going on. And that's an example of a man who said every life counts, and he did something for it.
But he's still a victim of the 3-day news cycle in the West. If he can be trying to shine his light all day long, the news is only going to keep focus for 3 days.
Well, actually, it lasted a lot longer when he did it. He was able to get the whole. He's the one who. He stayed there and got the world to follow what was going on, and eventually, things changed. But he's the one who was there and got the world the news, and we had news regularly of what was going on over there. It was not just a 3-day thing. It was quite a big thing back then.
That's good. Okay, well, so that's all of our clips and everything. So, Klingshore, you had what was your topic that you were?
I guess what's useful for me to come on here is to take the information that I've learned through, I guess, Islamic studies, Middle Eastern history studies, and the various primary sources that I read, and to be able to impart that knowledge to people. But more specifically, people will have certain questions or perceptions which hopefully I can help to clarify or elucidate or correct. So one really useful one that will help is this whole deal with Sharia and stuff like that. So I guess can I just do a spiel for a bit, and then once I give this information, then you feel free to ask questions, clarify, or to direct me onto areas that you guys find interesting or think deserves clarification. So I guess I'll start first of all with ideology. So what is ideology? Well, I would submit for a working definition, because we don't really think about words that we use, right? But how do you distinguish ideology from a belief system? I mean, I believe that evolution, is real, and also as a fact, and also that the theory of evolution, has predictive value and is therefore validated, right? That's a belief, right? Is that the same as believing that God created, mankind as Adam and Eve? No, we have different kinds of beliefs. I would submit that ideology is a moralistic belief system prescribing a correct model of society and often the correct behavior necessary to achieve that model, right? So nationalism is ideology. There should be, an Aryan nation, and we have to be militaristic to expunge the corrupting elements, whatever. The Armenians should have this great pan-Armenia, right? This is what I would call ideology, and religion is the same. So we should be living under, right, an Islamic state, right? Let's take the ISIS or whatever. We should be destroying shirk and bid'ah, etc., whatever, right? So this is what ideology is: how society should be and the correct behavior that you should do to get there. Does that make sense? Does that seem feasible?
Yes.
As a definition for ideology, right?
Yes.
So
absolutely.
Right. So I just want to keep that in the background here. Okay. So what's interesting is that my example is Islam, right? Islamic history. So how does Islam fare as an ideology in terms of its acceptance, interpretation, implementation? It's very interesting. So and when I was first reading this and discovering this information, I found it very confusing. Because I assumed, all right, ideology is the motivation, is a key factor to explain why people act. But what I found sort of contradicted that. So this is what I found. Here are some examples. So let's take alcohol, for example. Now the Quran, well, it has some verses seem to allow it and others forbid it, but within the Islamic exegetical tradition, this is interpreted as a progressive. First it was okay, and then it was abrogated to the point where you cannot drink alcohol. And the hadith are much stricter in this respect. So the punishment within the hadith, so Sahih Muslim, for example, contains a lot of these hadith, is lashing. The punishment for drinking alcohol is you get lashed, like torture essentially. But what do we find? We hear accounts of the drinking habits of early Muslim scholars and caliphs, like the Umayyads and the Abbasids used to drink alcohol. We hear of the drinking culture of medieval, say, Al-Andalus, where I think the second most commonly grown crop was grapes for wine, right? And you had all this massive drinking culture, and you had all this wine poetry and classical Arabic literature, and so on and so forth, right? So consistently throughout Islamic history, Muslim societies have consistently ignored this injunction. The Quran says don't drink, the Hadith say you get tortured if you drink, and Muslims have just ignored this. Or take homoeroticism, that's another good example. So the Quran says that homoerotic activity is fahisha, it's like a sin, sexual sin, right? And the Hadith are very strict. people who do the act of the people of Lot, as it's called. So sodomy is like the act of the people of Sodom in English. Arabic has a similar kind of system where the homosexual sex is called liwat, right? The act of Lot, or the people of Lot, right? So the hadith in the Jami of Tirmidhi, for example, one of the canonical Sunni hadith collections. Oh, hadith, by the way, is a saying attributed to Muhammad, right? Source of law. So the hadith of Muhammad saying basically kill homosexuals, kill people who do the act of Lot. You know, what's the specific? It doesn't matter. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so say kill people who do the act of Lot. Now, amal qaum Lut, I think is the Arabic. Anyway, the point is that this was and within the Islamic law schools is pretty consistent. So most of them prescribe death, although the Hanafis are discretionary. Anyway, this has been routinely ignored. So we find lots like caliphs, Abbasid caliphs, and Spanish Andalusian caliphs had male lovers, male concubines, were openly gay or homoerotic. You have this culture of homoeroticism throughout medieval Islamdom. So you have all this homoerotic poetry, for example. Gay prostitutes or male prostitutes for men were the highest paid of all prostitutes in medieval Muslim Spain, and so on and so forth, right? So again, it's sort of like, all right, so how do we square this? I mean, consistently, or take zina, for example. There are almost no instances within verifiable history, within the actual historical record, so going beyond the hadith, which are myth, right, to the actual verifiable Islamic history, there are almost no instances before the recent history of anyone being stoned to death for adultery. Almost none. They almost don't exist. So it's very strange, right? And the jurists actually implemented various legal stratagems to prevent anyone from ever having to be stoned to death or punished for adultery or fornication. So all these weird things like like the sleeping fetus. So the idea that a fetus can be developing in a woman's womb for years, like up to like 3 or 5 years. So if you get a woman who has a child out of wedlock, not wedlock, after she's been as a widow, right? Or if she's been divorced, right? Then that's empirical evidence she committed adultery, right? Or she had sex outside of marriage. Well, they say no, because she was married previously. So actually, she was impregnated legally, lawfully, and then divorced, and then the baby was inside her for a couple of years, and that's what happened. So that's real, like, that's a doctrine within Hanafi and Maliki jurisprudence, for example. So
do they still do that?
Weird.
Is that still anywhere?
I don't know if it's still actually practiced. Or take dhimmis, for example. So, the Quran says, attack the Christians and Jews and make them subject to the jizya and make them humbled and submissive. And so within Islamic legal thought, you have all these, you're not allowed to build churches higher than mosques. You're not allowed to ride on a horse. You have to ride on a donkey. You can't bear arms. You can't have any political position or power over a Muslim. But throughout Islamic history, this is often ignored, right? So you have Jews becoming like the viziers in Spain, for example. There was like a mob, and Jews were pogromed, and justification given was because they were given this power. But the point is that the laws were ignored, vis-a-vis this. Or in North Africa under the Abbasids, you had Christian bureaucracy. Most of the empire of the caliphate was non-Muslim, including their administration for like a century or so after the rise of Islam, and the population remained majority Christian for a lot longer than that. So again, the rules were often ignored, and what's quite interesting is that throughout most of Islamic history, Sharia just hasn't been implemented. The Islamic law hasn't been implemented. The Abbasids tried to implement it. They failed because it doesn't work. So they ended up confining Islamic law to inheritance law. These courts dealt with inheritance and marriage and stuff like that, right? This private law. And when it came to criminal and administrative law, they developed a parallel secular administrative legal system, which is often called qanun, which is from Greek canon. Anyway, so the claim that ideology such as Islam, Islamic law, the Quran, makes people act in a certain way doesn't fit. What we see consistently throughout history is that people ignore or interpret the ideology as they see fit in their contexts, and it's pretty consistent. And if you look at the movements when they did try to literally implement Islamic law, such as the Murabitun, the Muwahhidun, the Wahhabis, what you usually have is groups who are already on the margins, who come from these violent tribal environments. So a violent context produces a violent interpretation of Islam, right? Whereas these rich, secure, sedentary societies produce a more hedonistic or lax, or just a non-implementation of Islam. So I guess one thing that I think is very important is that ideology is passive or benign. In and of itself, it doesn't really have any causal value. So there's something independent of ideology that determines whether or not it's implemented, whether or not it's how it's interpreted. And this is borne out very clearly with Islamic history, where Muslims have consistently ignored the Sharia, not implemented it, ignored the Quran, or just not implemented these rules, flouted them, etc., etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, but I would take a little bit of a issue with part of that, in that for example, what it says in the Bible is Christian ideology, would be considered Christian ideology, but within Christianity you also have all these different ideas of what it means and interpretations of what it means. So you end up with people applying their other ideologies to their religious ideology. So like in America right now, we have this idea, I can't remember what it's called, but it's this idea that
libertarianism?
No, it's a different. It has to do with wealth. It has to do with if you believe in Jesus, you'll be wealthy.
Prosperity gospel.
It's prosperity doctrine.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So that is not just. That's definitely not a Christian or a strict biblical interpretation ideology. They're adding Randian philosophy into that, and they're adding Smith into that. I mean, they're taking all these different ideas and mixing. So an ideology is not necessarily just what your religion says. It's your worldview overall. And so your worldview is going to be affected by such things as how much strife there is and things like that. But it's not the religion itself that you're going to be calling your ideology. It's a bunch of things.
I guess that's true, but the same thing applies, is that the context usually determines, one, whether or not people accept ideology, two, how it's interpreted. So whether or not you have, for example, this gospel, prosperity gospel or libertarian or whatever interpretation, or a Catholic interpretation or whatever, how it's even interpreted is dependent on context or some other independent factors. And then the third one is whether or not you even implement it. Right, so the Islamic law is a good example, because at the time when you had the jurists in medieval Muslim Spain saying, yes, punishment for homosexuality, death, you had gay caliphs. I mean, people did not implement the laws and the jurisprudence and the theory that they identify with. And you see this. I mean, I remember once talking to a Muslim lady at my university who I went to uni with, and we're talking about morality or something, and she ended up admitting that she thinks homosexuals should be put to death. Gay people should be killed. But then she said, but I would never do that, right? I would never do that. So it's kind of like it's this, even when people have this interpretation of you should do X, they often will not actually implement it. There's like a non-implementation of people's ideals.
But that's her saying she wouldn't do it, but that's not her saying that she would defend them if it was being done. There's
Yeah, I guess that's true, but you still have this problem of states claiming to represent this idea and not actually implementing it, with pretty consistently throughout Islamic history, such as this thing of alcohol, for example. I mean, that's just pretty universal. Right. It's universally accepted within Islamic thought that alcohol is forbidden, and yet they just drank anyway. So I guess what I take away is that the variable of, and I'm going to quote myself here because I'm much more eloquent when I write than when I speak offhand. The variable of observable behaviors within the adherents of any given ideology indicates that their ideology, including their interpretation and implementation of their ideology, is determined and modulated by something independent of said ideology. And I would submit that the discernible determining and modulating factors like resource access, state policy, victim reactions to state policy, etc., are consistently reducible to class relations. That's my opinion.
That I would agree with 100%. Get back on the topic of alcohol and Islam. My father used to tell me this story, and I've never had anybody that I was able to verify it with. Maybe you know the answer to this or not. But he said that in World War I time in Arabia, I don't know where he got this information, but that they used to toast, and he said that in the hadiths it says the first drop of alcohol will not pass my lips, so they would spill the first drop on the ground and then drink the rest.
No, I haven't. That's fantastic, but I don't know about that hadith. I've never encountered. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It may well, but that's hilarious.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's just consistent. I mean, just look at the Saudis, for example. I mean, they in order to sort of consolidate their state, they identify with this Wahhabi ideology, right, which they use to bolster the state. This is to try and give them their state legitimacy. But the ruling family, I mean, like the stories that come out of they just ignore it. They're just fully hedonistic. They just do not care. The laws do not apply to them. The Islamic law does not apply to them. And when it's expedient, they will ignore it. So, for example, I find this interesting anyway. I'm throwing all these facts on you. I don't know if you find this interesting or informative. But,
yes, I do.
I do.
So far, I do.
So I'm going to make you subject to this anyway. So, for example, the Wahhabis back in the early 20th century, when they were expanding throughout Arabia, they had this Wahhabi ideology which enabled them to enslave. They were able to justify enslaving other Muslims in Arabia because they're saying, they're not pure Muslims, so we're legitimate to go and attack them, kill them, enslave them, right? But when this Wahhabi army, they're called the Al-Ikhwan, the Brotherhood, when they were became a problem for the King Saud and the Saudi ruling family, because they were then attacking and encroaching on the British territories in I think like Kabul.
We're losing you.
In Oman and these.
Yeah. We lost the last minute.
Yeah, your video froze for a second. But we can see you, but your video
what was the last? What was the? Oh, do you want me to turn it off and on?
No, it's doing it itself right now. Your video's gone, and now you're coming back. But,
what was the last thing that you heard?
I don't recall. What was the last thing that we heard before?
Whenever that happened. The Wahhabis.
Yeah, the Wahhab. It was about the Wahhabis.
Right. In a nutshell, when it's expedient, they ignore or subvert their ideology. So their ideology was they had this Ikhwan, this brotherhood, this army who were, in following Ibn Abdul Wahhab's vision of the Hanbali interpretation of Islam, attacking, conquering, expanding. And then the moment when it became not expedient anymore, so when this Ikhwan army was encroaching on British colonial interests in the region, the Saudis were allied with the British to some degree, and they knew that this would be a problem because the British could crush them. So they actually ended up killing and destroying their own army, the Ikhwan, so that the Ikhwan wouldn't impact upon, so that they would not be attacking these British colonies and thus threatening the rule of the Saudis, who would then be threatened by the British reaction. So whenever it's expedient, they just turn against their own ideology and disregard it or subvert it. So I just find it really interesting. Right. And this is
there's an internet meme that sums that up pretty well. Where there's an episode of Futurama where the robots are coming from space, and the news announcer says, "But I, for one, welcome our intergalactic overlords." So he says, "Everything that I've ever believed in, I don't believe it anymore because they're coming."
So do you have any? Anyway, this is this issue of ideology and its passivity and it being determined by context is something that I find particularly interesting, and that's what I think is something that is worth sharing with people vis-a-vis common perceptions of the threat of ideology, etc., etc. But do you guys have any areas of interest or anything that you want to hear elucidated?
Well, I did, because we're a news show and we like to keep people educated on what's going on in the world of religion and news. As I mentioned before we actually went on the air, I was talking about the Reclaim Australia movement, which is basically run by a bunch of like right-wing, crazy reactionaries, as I understand it, but it has a lot of popular support among people who just don't really seem to understand. And again, it's the same kind of thing where they're afraid of creeping Sharia irrationally. I'll tell a quick story. Before I even heard anything about Reclaim Australia, about 2 months ago, a friend of mine does web design, and she had this woman in Australia that she was doing web design for, and the woman wanted to write a book, and I publish, I'm a self-published writer, and so my friend asked me to talk to her about what you need to do this. So I friended this woman on Facebook, and I talked to her about that for a couple of days, and then I started seeing her posting stuff about the Muslims in her community and how cloistered they are and how they're you can't trust them and what they're planning. And she just began to creep me out, and I had to unfriend her because I didn't even want to see that stuff showing up on my. I wanted to just lay into her and say, "What the fuck is wrong with you, lady?" But and I didn't realize that it was that big a thing. But apparently, it's all over parts of Australia where it's like a huge issue.
It's a trend at the moment, yeah. I mean, Australia has a long history of this kind of stuff. I mean, you just go back and look at, like, the anti-Chinese propaganda was insane back in the late 1800s. You know, what are they called? The Mongolian octopus, and he's just like this really hilarious, you know, like propaganda, and so Australia actually has a long history of like race riots and conservative, like nativism and violence against immigrants. So this is just, I guess, another example. I guess the thing that annoys me is that every single time the conservatives, the reactionaries say, these guys are going to destroy us, these guys are going to ruin our society, and every single time they are wrong. Every time they were wrong, right? They're there are always some teething problems, cultural barriers, blah, blah, blah. And within 3 generations, it's usually done. Everyone's integrated and there's not really a problem. And the new group will bring over their food and their cuisine and some fashion and whatever, right? And so it's sort of like, okay, we were wrong about every single group previously, but this time, this group, this is the real deal. Right. These guys will destroy us. We were wrong every single time with every single other group. We were wrong, right?
This time there really is a wolf.
But this time, and it's like, I just give me a break. I mean, and so look, so with this, I mean, I kind of ignore the media and I ignore this kind of goings on. So I'm not even that familiar with this Reclaim Australia rally. I just, it's just whatever. It's just rhetoric and hot air and these idiots protesting. Fine. Now, but what I will say is that I understand the fear, right? Because you go onto the telly and you see all of this. You know, there's ISIS and there's all these groups and they're killing people and they're horrible, etc., right? And then you watch I don't know, Today Tonight or whatever, all these shitty investigative journalist TV shows that we have in Australia, and they'll be like, oh, neighborhood is being taken over, or in this neighborhood no one speaks English, or whatever. Like this, you have this, and they'll oh look, there's this one Wahhabi guy who says these shitty things or whatever. Fine, right? And so people, and he talk to people, you go on the internet and you read, oh, Muhammad said kill, massacred the Qurayza Jews, and oh no, and so it forms this, forms this sort of narrative of fear, and people are scared, right? But my problem is, right, that most of it's kind of rubbish, right? It's most of the claims and the fears are based upon either falsehood or massive over-exaggeration, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. So I've talked to people and they've said, oh, Muslims are trying to get rid of Santa Claus in kindergarten and schools, right? They're trying to, you can't have, we're Muslims, you can't force this Christianity on us, so get no more Santa in the kindergarten, right? Oh no, they're taking over and they're, changing our culture and forcing us to adapt. Now, I researched this, right? And I'm not saying there hasn't been instances of it, but I wasn't able to find any. This is what I found, right? So I found a story about how the Herald Sun, which is a notable conservative Australian newspaper, has lied about these issues. Okay. Then I found a story about in South Australia about this Muslim schoolgirl who's been leading this campaign to make people aware that there's no problem. Muslims don't have a problem with having having Santa Claus in the kindergarten and school, whatever, and we're cool with that. All right. And then I found an official statement by the Victorian Islamic Council, or whatever it's called, the Islamic Council of Victoria, which officially said, yeah, we're totally cool. You can have Santa Claus. We don't have a problem with Santa Claus in the kindergarten. It's all good, etc., etc., right? So it's like, all right, so this picture that's emerging is quite different from the one that I heard from these people who were afraid and stuff, right? And then what I found was there was an instance of Santa being banned from coming to school due to the religious sensitivity of students. But it wasn't Muslims, it was Jews, and also I think Hindus. So it's just kind of like,
and it was probably also the Christians making the overt effort there. It probably wasn't a reaction to complaint by the Jews and Hindus. It was probably I'm assuming it would be the Christians going, well, we have these Jews, maybe we shouldn't have Santa.
Right. I mean, I that's also a thing that people claim is, so that's what I think the South Australia Muslim girl was saying was people are preemptively being really sensitive, but it's okay. People, like, Santa Claus is fine. You don't have to withdraw Santa Claus. So that's one example. I'll give you another example. This one's actually an American example, but you have the same kind of phenomenon, the same kind of over exaggerations. These little news stories that people pass from link on Facebook and share and oh no and whatever, and chain emails. Here's another example of this. So there was this instance in America, right, where you go into these like Jihad Watch and all these whatever, stop Islamization, and the headlines scream, Muslims stone Christians in America, right? And it's like, oh, this is Sharia law in America. The Islamization is underway. Oh my God. It's like, wow, what actually happened? Well, I went and I read the court transcripts from the case, right? And so what happened was a group of Christian reactionaries turned up at an Arab festival with a pig's head on a stick in Dearborn, with an actual pig's head on a stick, right? With T-shirts saying, what was it, like "fuck Muhammad" or something like that, like with a megaphone saying Muhammad, your Islam is false, Muhammad was a pedophile, etc., right? And some mostly a couple of children threw some rubbish at them, right? And some pebbles,
saw that.
Right?
I saw the video.
That's what. Hey?
I saw the video.
Yeah,
I saw it.
That's. Huh?
I saw it. I saw the video. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, and that becomes in the reporting.
Mm-hmm.
Muslims are stoning Christians in America and implementing Sharia law. I mean, it's just crazy. So, I mean, it's or another example, right? So there was a big protest in Perth, right? But a Muslim protest against ISIS, right? And I know about this because I had a friend who was there, right? Now the news rocks up. Does the news show the protest? No. What they show is like one or two, a tiny handful of these crazy Wahhabis were like, yeah, go ISIS, right? Just a tiny number of people. They show them, and then they also show these crazy, xenophobic, anti-Islamic protesters. And so what ends up in the news is, crazy psycho Muslim protest and people protesting against them. And whereas the actual thing was this massive protest against ISIS. Right, so I mean, this is, and so when you have all these kinds of materials and processes, constantly washing over people, people become afraid. There's this narrative is built. There's an enemy figure subverting us. You should be afraid, and so people look at all this information and look at ISIS and these groups overseas, and they become afraid, and that's how people are mobilized into these rallies, Reclaim Australia. So I understand why they're afraid. I just think that it's mostly based upon information that is distorted or false. And that's my take on these kind of movements.
The thing is, that kind of stuff happens because some of the people in power or would like to be in power are trying to get the people's attention away from the real problem. So
right. Yeah, that's what I said. They gin up false narratives in order to. It's all a straw man. They build straw mans so that they can be the hero.
I remember in watching American presidential. What was it? It was all these Republican Party politicians explaining their who were vying with each other to become president. I don't know what this is called. I don't know what the words are for what stage of the primaries. I don't know what the words are. Anyway, you had these Republicans saying, "This is what I will do. You should vote for me. This is what I'm going to do." And a lot of them are like, "Yeah, I'm going to clamp down on Sharia law," as if there's this plague of. There's these Islamic enclaves where Islamic law is the law of the land in swaths of America, and it's going to take these politicians, so they definitely exploit these kinds of sentiments. Another important thing is that this anti-Islam network, right? This isn't like an accident. There is a set of people who consistently output most of these materials are traceable back to quite a small handful of people, right? It's not like lockstep, but it's like a de facto organic alliance of convenience between various people who are producing this material. And essentially what you have, hold on, let me. There's a great report on this called Fear Inc., but they've also now created a database, and it has a really, really simple graph that shows you the massive funding that these people get from all these various think tanks, etc., etc. Well, let me see if I can actually find it. It's called the Islamophobia Network. And so you have, hold on, it's just loading. This is, explore the network. All right, here we go. So you have Donors Capital Fund, which contributed $27 million. The Clarion Project, which I think is connected to the Donors Capital Fund. 18 million. You've got the Scaife Foundations, the Lyndon Harriet Bradley Foundation, the Rosenwald Middle Road and Abstraction Fund, which then they funnel all these really conservative organizations and think tanks. They then funnel all this money into, like, the David Horowitz Freedom Center and this Clarion Project, and they then fund all these anti-Islamic researchers: Daniel Pipes, Robert Spencer, Stephen Emerson. He was famous recently for claiming that there are these Muslim no-go zones in cities in the UK where non-Muslims can't go, right? Yeah. And they then fund all this research, which then gets passed on to all these activists like Pamela Geller, like Brigitte Gabriel, like Walid Shoebat, and these people go around, they give all these talks all throughout America, and they have all these big popular blogs, and this is where all the material for, like, Act for America, Stop the Islamization of America, etc., comes from. So all of this hysteria doesn't come out of nowhere. There's actually a concerted campaign by certain interests to facilitate this. Now, what's especially interesting is when you get down to it, most of the key figures in this movement are clearly identifiable. You can trace a lot of this back to a very specific conflict and a very specific interest in the Middle East. There is a specific conflict that generates this, and it's the Israel conflict. If you look at a lot of the key figures in this, most of them, in fact, almost all of them, are extreme Zionists. And when you look at the origins of most of the literature for this, most of it goes back to a lady called Bat Yor, right? And so what Bat Yor has created is okay. So basically, post 1967, you have the rise of religious Zionism, and you have the rise of the creation of this narrative of a Jewish Muslim. A cosmic Jewish-Muslim conflict, right? So what's happening in Israel and the Middle East? It isn't because Israel has stolen lots of land and have sort of expunged all these people from this territory in ethnic cleansing, and then conquered this other land and systematically taking it away and giving it to settlers. No. It's because of this cosmic Jewish-Muslim conflict, right? It's because of this Islamic animus against Jews and Christians, right? And so this becomes a means to galvanize Jewish-Christian solidarity against Muslims. So you have out of this conflict, and it's pretty, let's see, overview. It's pretty hilarious when you go through the list of people who are involved, and what their background. So Andrew Bostom, right, big producer of a lot of these works like Islamic anti-Semitism, right, and some of the material he synthesizes is good academic material, but a lot of it is distorted for this political agenda. Well, he's conservative, Jewish, and Zionist. Giselle Littman, Bat Yor, again, another one of the key people who produces the material, like the academic material that underpins this movement. Conservative, Jewish, Zionist. David Yerushalmi.
It's also evangelicals, though. It's not just.
Oh yeah, that's true. It's true. There's an alliance here, right? David Yerushalmi, conservative, Jewish, Zionist. Robert Spencer. Now he's a Christian. So here we have a conservative Christian ally to these people. And I think Stephen Emerson is, I think, an evangelical Christian. I'm not sure. So you have these. This hasn't come out of nowhere. You have these very specific political interests whose political needs are facilitated by promoting this kind of material. So it's not an accident, right? This isn't like, oh, it's developed out of nowhere. People have exploited the current conflicts in the Middle East, like 9/11, for example, and it's facilitating their political interests. And you're right, the conservative Christians, it plays into their power base as well to be able to point to the Bible and say, look, Israel is reborn. It helps, this ideology helps to sort of facilitate their control and to facilitate their interests. So I guess, and this is not a conspiracy. This is easily verifiable. I mean, you just have to research the interests and the and the identity of all the key people involved in this picture emerges, and also the
But it is a
identifiable.
conspiracy. It is a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy in the sense that it's subverted and that it's kept secret. It's right out there in the public.
Right. It's not like, oh, there's like. This is a very natural.
It's not like the Illuminati.
Right. This is a natural, organic alliance of convenience between people whose interests are facilitated by this. Right. So it's anyway. So the information. So I guess that's another thing that I find particularly annoying with this is that the discourse is poison. Instead of us being able to clearly look at, okay, what does, look at Islamic history, look at the Quran, look at these militant movements, what do they say, are their motivations, and what's the data that sort of can give us some sort of causal mechanism for what leads to this kind of behavior, how does it rise and fall, etc., etc. We get this hysterical narratives and all this trash thrown into the public discourse by this political interest. So anyway, I've rambled for too long though. So I'm sorry. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up the show because we've gone well over an hour now. But this was all fascinating. I was enthralled the whole conversation. So you can.
We had a great time. Thank you.
Yeah. So other than your channel on YouTube, is there anything else that you want to let people know about where they can find your work online?
I guess what I mostly do is I write articles on my blogs. So my blogs are let's see. Let me actually just what's the exact? Okay, research-islam.blogspot.com, for example, is where I write academic, quasi-academic. I'm not yet an academic, right? But this is where my academic materials are, right? So this is like serious research into the origins of the Quran and Islamic history and these kinds of issues. For my more political stuff, my blog is Klingshore, KLINGSCHOR.blogspot.com. Now, for both of these blogs, I also have accompanying YouTube channels, with a Klingshore YouTube channel and a youtube.com/researching Islam, one word, no hyphen. I guess that's where I input most of my materials. So yeah, I guess that's it.
Well, awesome. Make sure that you send me a text, via Skype, and then with all those addresses, and I will add them in the show description.
Sure.
We'll put them on the show notes also. Okay, so hopefully we'll have you on again sometime. But this.
No worries. It was a pleasure.
Good. Glad you were here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap the show. Nicole, is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, that's all for today. Please make sure that you subscribe to the Atheism TV channel. There you can watch the Infidel News for the Damned, where our talented team of writers and anchors present these and other stories not normally covered in the media. In the coming week, the Infidel will rerun today's stories and many more fascinating ones. You'll find Atheism TV at youtube.com/atheismtv. The Infidel Podcast of the Damned is a Nicole SD production. Nicole and I would like to recognize and say thank you to Truth Surge, who did the voiceover used in our intro and gave us permission to use music from his song Lied To as our opening theme. We'd also like to thank Klingshore for participating in today's podcast. Thank you again, sir. Nicole's channel is Nicole SD and can be found at youtube.com/NICOLSD. I am Gamut Man on YouTube, at Gamut Man on Twitter, and my blog and information on my books, including my nonfiction title, Believe It, You Know an Atheist, as well as my mystery novels featuring the atheist detective Lupa Schwartz, can be accessed at tinyurl.com/lupalanding. While there, you can sign up to receive my newsletter. Signing up also entitles you to choose one free ebook title from my collection of 99-cent novellas. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Good night.
Cheers.